Hello, everyone, and welcome to our college novel lecture series for the Sussex County Community College 2021-2022 academic year. Today, we're fortunate to have joining us Professor Eileen Sweeney, who is a professor of English at Wake Tech Community College in North Carolina, where she's beginning her 14th year. In addition to the fact that she hails from the state that is the setting of this year's college novel, which is nice, but really just a coincidence, we have asked her to speak because of her expertise in this specific type of writing. Specifically, Delia Owens, the author of Where the Crawdads Sing, has been compared quite frequently to famed American author Barbara Kingsolver due to her evocative portrayal of the natural world and the creating of the very strong female protagonist we find in Kaya. Now, Professor Sweeney's master thesis is entitled, and you'll excuse me, I'm going to read this to make sure I get it correct, An Ecofeminist Critique of the Novels of Barbara Kingsolver, Defining Home, Family, and Identity. Now, I think anyone who has read Owens' novel will immediately understand why this author has been compared to Kingsolver. And we're so happy to have Professor Sweeney here with us today to guide us through discussion of some of those connections. So welcome, Professor Sweeney.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson. It's nice to be here with everybody.
And although we are continuing to deal with the pandemic, I'm happy to have the upside of being able to invite you to be here with us today, because obviously, if the world was normal or relatively normal, we wouldn't have that opportunity due to distance. So thank you. So first of all, thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule. I know that everyone is incredibly busy with the commencement of a new academic year, and we appreciate you sharing your expertise with us today.
I am honored to be here.
Now, first and foremost, looking at the title of your master's thesis, can you define the term ecofeminist for us, as it's going to be so important to the discussion we're going to have today?
Absolutely. So the voice I like the most within this theory is Patrick Murphy's. He's published quite a number of articles, but in 1998, he seemed to take a bunch of his writing together and put it all together in a larger book called Ecofeminist Literary Criticism, Theory, Interpretation, and Pedagogy. And he attempts to not only show that ecofeminism is an activism first, and then a theory, and then a literary theory, but to also place it within the larger schools of literary theory, like deconstruction and Marxism, both of which tend to work a lot with binaries. And so he has a really simplistic for him definition that says ecofeminism is a practical movement for social change that discerns interconnections among all forms of oppression. The exploitation of nature, the oppression of women, class exploitation, racism, colonialism, against binary divisions of self and other, culture and nature, man and woman, human and animal, white and non-white. Ecofeminist theory asserts that human identity is shaped by more fluid relationships and by an acknowledgement of both connection and difference. And he goes on to explain that in even simpler terms, because I don't know that his definition is all that simple, that the way that women, children, and minorities are treated by the power structure. So we have those two binaries are directly akin to the binaries of the way the natural world is treated by the binaries, by the power structure. And so he really does place women, children, and minorities in the same way that the power structure claims dominion over nature. And so, like, both of these writers are obviously dealing with the impacts of the natural world. You know, every book Kingsolver has deals with this issue, but Owens does the same thing. We have a ton of binaries happening. We have, you know, the marsh girl up against the townies when she's little and she can't even pay for groceries because no one ever taught her money. But at some point, the corporate world wants to come in and take over the marsh. And she goes into town, she figures out how to do it, she pays her taxes. And so we have a ton of these binaries that are set up in order to protect the environment, but only by one person. Mm-hmm. And so ecofeminism is sort of that interplay between the non-powered and the empowered.
So that kind of feeds nicely into my next question, which is how we might consider Kaya to be an ecofeminist. And you've already given us a couple of examples. Can you provide any more from the novel that our students might recognize?
She's a world of activism unto herself. She has a whole collection. We're told, I think page 146, we're told that as Tate is leaving for college, her collection has matured. Her collections of shells, feathers, almost anything that she can find in the world around her. Her collections matured, categorized methodically by order, genus, and species, by age according to bone wear, by size in millimeters of feather, by the most fragile hues of greens. She has a collection, but in creating this whole thing that she's done to surround herself, even in her home by the marsh, she never destroys anything. She never takes a feather from a bird. She takes a feather from the ground. She never takes a shell out of the water. She takes the shell off the beach. And so, like, her very quiet way of living within her world, of cataloging her world, and then creating the art to represent it in her published book, she's a world of activism all by herself.
Without even consciously saying that that's what she's doing. It's just the way that she lives and the way she exists in the natural world.
Yes.
That's one of the things I love. I find it so beautiful.
It is. And she, even early in the book, when she talks about how lonely she is, she satisfies that loneliness by going outside. Mm-hmm. She has that rooster that she likes and the hawk that she likes. And she goes out and she feeds the gulls every single day what little food she has. And no one ever had to say, go and share, tread lightly. She just knows it within her.
Mm. And I know that Delia Owens is trained as a scientist.
Yes.
How do you think she uses the language of biology and the natural sciences? And is that in any way similar to what Kingsolver does?
So Owens and Kingsolver are weirdly parallel. And I'm not sure I can find anything anywhere that says like they've ever sat down and had a cup of coffee. They both have degrees in the sciences. So Owens has a BS in zoology and then master and PhD in animal behavior, specifically the behaviors of carnivores. Kingsolver started her BA in music. And then, she was a piano player, and then she switched to biology. And in her undergrad, she took a creative writing class. And so she married the two. Owens writes, she's had several other books published with her husband about natural environmental stuff. Kingsolver went on to do her master's in biology and evolutionary sciences. And both women take the language of biology and of animal behavior and apply it to their characters. But they both have these really weird other parallels. They've both spent time living in Africa. They've both been residents of the Appalachian region. They both write from this perspective of how do we live amongst people in such poverty and how do we get people to understand? And so it sort of becomes that language of the different biological systems. Like we can't talk about the pulmonary system as separate from the respiratory system. And so when we talk about how humans live in and amongst each other, we have all of these different languages of biology. Like the one chapter in Kingsolver's The Bean Trees, the traffic in Tucson, Arizona is compared to the pulmonary system, the arteries and the veins, and how blood moves faster on this way when the traffic's going in that direction. And so that language of biology becomes essential. But they both, they have a similar writing style that's almost poetry, but not quite poetry, where they're trying to create strong images of the natural world. Because we all understand what it looks like when the leaves are changing, or we all understand, how those tides roll in or roll out. But we don't all know the systems even within our own bodies. And we don't always understand how the systems within nature work. And so both writers, again, that weird parallel where they're trying really strongly to understand that everything in our bodies is connected and everything between us and the natural world is connected. There's no difference. And so they both use that language in order to the language of science in order to draw the near poetry of their writing. Kaya, for instance, learns how to find oysters that she wants to sell down at Jumpin's place by watching the birds. Mm-hmm. And she figures out where the oysters are. And Taylor in the bean trees, because that seems to be the character that any critic mostly aligns Kaya with. She learns things like, well, there's little tiny bugs that help plants grow. And so the bean trees of the title of that book cannot grow without the rhizobia, those microscopic organisms. And so they use the languages of their sciences in order to make this much bigger point.
And I love that sense of connectedness, and it just stresses so much that we are part of the natural world, and also that we are animals. We can look at animal behavior and explain an awful lot about human behavior. And that kind of leads into my next question, because I was wondering how both Kingsolver and Owens handle their characters when they have to integrate not just with the natural world, but with the world of quote unquote civilization, or in this case, the town.
And so I think for Kaya, that's a problematic relationship. So when she's little, Kaya's brother says, like, don't go to school. When the truant lady comes, make sure you hide. She goes to school for one day and her self-esteem is destroyed. But she has to go into town to buy groceries, and she doesn't know how to do this, and she knows that everybody's pointing to her. But when she's growing and Tate comes around and Tate teaches her how to read and how to do basic math, and then Chase comes around, we have these male characters that interact with her, and both of them tell her that she can't live in town, that she's not made for town. Mm-hmm. And so, like, at least when I'm reading it, my question for Kaya is like, is this actually Kaya who can't leave the marsh? Or is it because she's been led that way by a male voice? And so Kaya, I think in certain places in her relationship in town becomes really problematic. Tate goes away and he says, like, there's no way she can live in his college world with him. And it takes him a long time to come to, well, he can come to her. Mm-hmm. That was Tate. And Chase says he's going to marry her, and then, plays it off by saying, there's no way you could live in town. And the only time she does live in town is during her trial. And, it's easy to point to how the language in that part of the text changes.
Yes.
Kaya's very stilted there. Oh yeah, it's a huge tone change, and it's almost like a different writing about a different character. But this is somebody who feeds the gulls every day, who knows the tides, who understands only the natural world because no one's ever let her be a part of town. So of course she would be separate from herself. So those prison walls, that window that only lets her see for a little part of the day when the fog lifts off the marsh, she's totally out of her element in a way she would not be if she were living in a home. Mm-hmm. And the only part of nature she has in there is when Sunday the cat comes to keep her company. Yeah. And that seems to be the only time she relaxes, when she has that little small part of something other than herself. So the relationship with the town is a huge problem for Kaya.
Yeah. And that also, because it is so problematic, because she has such a strained relationship and because she's always told that she can't be part of this world, is that why we see what some critics have said is such a dramatic shift into very, very stilted dialogue, when we've had all of this wonderful lyrical description of the marsh and the tides and the birds and all of the things that surround her normally?
Yeah, and not to hit Owens, but it feels almost pat to some readers. It's been overdone. Like, how many times have we seen on TV or read in a book, suddenly we have the big dramatic trial and the whole town comes out. Mm-hmm. But even with that pretty common plot twist, there's no language of nature that we can build in. Mm-hmm. And so, the concrete walls, this isn't her, big excitement like we get from Thoreau in Resistance, when he spends his one night in the prison and it's a big adventure. This is not an adventure for her. There's there's nothing of her normal world. She can't smell the air that she's used to. She can't interact with the animals that she's used to. And so and there's no poetic language we can use for a prison cell and the courtroom, especially because these plot twists have been done and done and done. And so it does feel like a giant change, but it's probably a necessary change in the language because it's a fundamental change in who Kaya is at that moment. You know, she's not the marsh girl when she's locked up in town. Sorry, my dog is now barking.
Well, it's in the world. That's fine. It works with the theme here.
And so there is a big tone change in that part of the novel, but it has to change. The form and the function have to mirror one another. Otherwise, you know, the function's going to lose its thrust.
I like that. So it's not a flaw. It's a conscious choice to.
It feels like it
to Kaya when she's. It's almost, you can almost see her withering away. It's like taking a plant and putting it in a very dark room. Almost stops existing.
And she's so used to eating from the marsh, and you know, she gets some groceries to supplement, but somebody's bringing her food she didn't prepare every day. Like everything from what she eats to what she wears to what she sees and interacts with is in somebody else's control. And so she's not Kaya at that moment. We get the same thing in Kingsolver's Prodigal Summer when Deanna Wolfe tells us about when she lived in Knoxville with her ex-husband, and he makes fun of her Kentucky accent. She doesn't live well amongst other people. She said she lived in Knoxville for 10 years and she didn't fit in. And so she made the conscious decision to go back to school and to get her degrees, and then, you know, in biology, and then to go live on a mountain by herself. And the mountain overlooks her hometown, but she is separate from and much more comfortable that way. She's much more comfortable looking for the coyote's den than running into the diner in town for something to eat.
Yep, and I can definitely see that that same sort of lack of comfort with the town here. Now, we also have, obviously this is a novel, it's a prose work of fiction, but we have poetry scattered throughout, which without any spoilers, in case anyone hasn't read the entire book. Do you think this is just a way to further the plot, or what do you think of the poems in the novel? Do they hold some deeper meaning, or is it just Owen saying, well, this is a good way to get to where I want to be in the novel?
Well, the poems aren't very good.
They're not fantastic, I don't think.
Yeah, they're not. Yeah, they're not going to be the verse that somebody's reciting in a moment of deep emotion, but I think they allow Owens to sort of harken back to different places in the novel. Like the last one that Tate finds, the firefly, which obviously is a confession from Kaya about what happened to Chase, and I won't ruin that part of the book. But earlier in the book, we have a conversation about the way fireflies talk to each other. And so she connects different pieces of the book with the poetry. You know, she has a conversation somewhere in the early 140s. The narrator tells us that, you know, the ... dash that fireflies do when they're talking to each other is how the males and females communicate to each other. And then she somehow communicated with Chase that did not end well for him.
Yes.
And so the poem allows us to tie all of those pieces together. But I think it's also that idea of the binaries that ecofeminism leads us to, that the natural world, the way that humans interact with each other, the way that we communicate is not that different from the way animals and insects and birds and all of the creatures communicate. We know that even trees are communicating with each other just so differently than we are. And so if Kaya is an artist, this is one more medium to prove her artistic work, but I think it's also one of those ways that we draw the binaries between the artist and the outside world.
Yeah, and it also stresses again that interconnectedness of all things, which I tend to see as a thread that's running throughout the entire novel.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
it makes building
human beings both very small and very important at the same time.
All at the same time.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
And so when we build like a conversation in the system of the body, you can't talk about the pulmonary without the respiratory.
Nope.
And so if you can't take Kaya out of the marsh because she's part and parcel, she understands how these insects talk to each other.
Now, the purpose of the college novel at Sussex County, and I know you know this because you actually spoke to us many years ago about Barbara Kingsolver when The Bean Trees was our college novel. But the purpose is to foster a love of reading and a love of literature and to give us something to talk about in different classes across disciplines. Do you think that the bean trees, sorry, that was a good choice. Do you think that Where the Crawdads Sing is a good choice for our college novel, knowing what the purpose of the work is?
I do. I think it's one of those books that not only fits a conversation of how humans fit into the natural world, but it's about intersectionalities.
Mm-hmm.
And so a liberal education where we are delving into all different disciplines, the novel totally fits that approach to how we tend to set up those 60 core credits for our students, because at least here in North Carolina, we are concerned all the time about the effects of weather. All right, for some reason, we aren't getting any of these hurricanes today. But normally at this time of year, we're very worried about hurricanes and beach erosion and road erosion. So we're one of the fastest growing states in the country. The area where I live is one of the fastest growing areas in this state. So what used to be farmlands and wetlands and forests are now developments. And so if you want to, get a degree in civics or poli-sci and work for municipal government, you have to worry about how all these things are impacted. So like when Kaya pays the taxes on the land the shack is on, and she keeps a corporation from getting that land to drain and build, she's saving a part of the natural environment. But what we tend not to talk about when like all the farmlands around me have been sold to build another giant development is, where's that water going to go when we get one of those hurricanes? Mm-hmm. And we tend to get a couple of them. We get several inches of rain in each one. And now all of the plants that would absorb that water are gone. So we get to apply the book to ecology, mm-hmm. and to biology and zoology. Like all of the big ologies are here. And, I think even when we talk about ecofeminism and those binaries that happen, there's a real reverence that happens in the text and in the conversations. And that same reverence is one of those things that we're trying to help our students to learn in every discipline, that intellectual humility. Yeah. So what does happen if a corporation buys a marsh and dries it out? Where is the water going to go? We might not be individually worried about every species of frog or mushroom, but they're all interconnected. And so what then happens? Somebody has to be able to understand those connections. Yeah.
Plus, it's just a good read. It's one of those books that I picked up and I was thinking, I don't know. And then I got sucked into the story. So I think from that standpoint, it works too.
We had several teenagers here for a birthday party this weekend, and they saw my collection of books sitting on the coffee table, and three 16-year-olds picked up the book and said, "Oh, I bought this. I haven't read it yet, but I bought this."
Well, that's good. They can put it on their list.
It was really exciting, though, to hear somebody like not even in college excited to read this book.
Yeah. And I think when we are in the academic year, we get so focused on, academics, as we should, that sometimes we lose that fun. So it's nice to have a little bit of that, that intrigue and that enjoyment as well.
It really is.
And speaking of enjoyment, I've really enjoyed our conversation today. Thank you so much again for taking time from your schedule at Wake Tech Community College to join us at Sussex County virtually for our college novel lecture. We appreciate your time and your expertise, and it's always wonderful speaking with you.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
All right, so check back to our YouTube channel for more lectures on the college novel throughout the academic year. All right, once again, Professor Eileen Sweeney, thank you so much, and I wish you a wonderful day and a wonderful academic year.
Thank you. You too.